It was a quiet evening in the small town. The sun had just set, casting a soft orange glow over the streets. The air was cool, and the only sound was the occasional car passing by. But in this peaceful town, something was about to happen that would change everything. Officer Brian Miller was finishing his shift at the local police station. He was young, only 28, and had been a cop for 3 years. He had seen all sorts of things, from petty theft to fights in bars, but he wasn't expecting anything unusual tonight. He was ready to go home, kick his feet up, and enjoy a quiet night in front of the TV. But as he walked out of the station, something caught his eye. At the edge of the street, under the streetlight, was an elderly man. The man was hunched over, his white hair tangled, and his face deeply wrinkled. He stood there, holding the worn-out Bible in his hands, staring down at the ground. Officer Miller had seen this man before. He was known around the town as Pastor Sam, an old preacher who had lived here for decades. He was harmless, just a kind old man who often talked to people about faith and peace. But tonight, something seemed different. Officer Miller shook his head, thinking the man must have been lost or confused. It wasn't uncommon for Pastor Sam to wander around town, but usually he wasn't out this late. Officer Miller walked toward him, hoping to get him back to his house before it got too late. "Hey, Pastor Sam, you okay?" Officer Miller asked, his voice friendly but firm. The old man didn't look up. He just stood there, motionless. His hands gripped the Bible so tightly that his knuckles were white. There was something strange about the way he was standing, something unsettling in the way he seemed to be waiting for something, or perhaps someone. "Pastor Sam." Officer Miller tried again, his voice a bit louder this time. The old man slowly lifted his head, and Officer Miller could see his eyes, deep, tired, and filled with a sadness that was almost too heavy to bear. It was the kind of sadness that made Officer Miller feel uneasy, as if he were looking into the soul of a man who had seen more than anyone should ever have to. "I'm sorry, son," Pastor Sam said softly, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to bother you." Officer Miller frowned. "You're not bothering anyone, but you shouldn't be out here so late. Let me get you home." Pastor Sam shook his head slowly, his hand tightening around the Bible. "I can't go home," he whispered. "Not yet." The officer was confused. "Why not?" The old man didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at the ground again, as if lost in thought. Officer Miller waited, wondering what the man was thinking. Finally, Pastor Sam spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "There's something wrong here, son. Something bad is coming. You can't stop it," he said, his eyes locking onto the officer's with a strange intensity. Officer Miller felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to make sense of the old man's words. Pastor Sam took a deep breath and finally looked up, his face filled with a mixture of sorrow and urgency. "I've seen it in my dreams. I've been praying, hoping it wouldn't come. But I've been wrong before. It's coming, and it's going to change everything." "Change everything? What are you saying?" Officer Miller asked, starting to feel uncomfortable. This was not the kind of conversation he was used to having with the locals. Pastor Sam stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Something is about to happen, and it's going to hurt a lot of people. You have to be ready. Son, be ready." Officer Miller took a step back, not knowing what to make of the man's words. He had heard Pastor Sam talk about his dreams before, odd, cryptic messages that never seemed to mean anything. But this felt different. The man's voice, the way he looked at him, it was as if he truly believed something terrible was about to happen. And for the first time, Officer Miller didn't know how to respond. "I'm not sure what you mean, Pastor Sam," the officer said, trying to remain calm. "You've been through a lot. Maybe you should get some rest. Let me take you home." The old man's eyes hardened, and for a brief moment, Officer Miller could see the strength that still lingered in him, despite his age. "You'll see soon enough," Pastor Sam said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. But by then, it might be too late. Before the officer could respond, Pastor Sam turned and began to walk away, his steps slow but purposeful. Officer Miller stood there for a moment, watching the old man disappear into the shadows of the street. The words hung in the air, heavy and mysterious. Something was coming. Something bad. And Officer Miller couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, the old preacher was right. The next day, Officer Brian Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He tried to brush off the encounter with Pastor Sam as just another strange moment in his line of work. But the old man's words kept ringing in his ears, haunting him as he went about his day. It was just a few hours after his shift started when he received the call. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. Unit 23, we've got a disturbance reported in the old church area. There's a man saying things, strange things, requesting backup. Miller's heart skipped a beat. The old church. Pastor Sam's church. Without thinking, he switched on his lights and sirens and headed for the location. It wasn't a place he normally patrolled, but he had passed it many times. The church had been abandoned for years, left to rot in the middle of the town. It was an eerie place, surrounded by overgrown weeds and thick vines that seemed to strangle the old stone walls. Nobody really went near it anymore, but rumors about it always circulated. Some said it was haunted. Others swore it was cursed. Miller wasn't superstitious, but as he pulled up to the church, he felt an uncomfortable chill creeping down his spine. He parked his car a few feet away from the building and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel as he walked toward the entrance. The door was cracked open. Miller hesitated, then pushed it open fully, the rusty hinges creaking loudly as it swung wide. Inside, the darkness was thick, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. He could barely make out the dusty pews and old stained glass windows that were long past their prime. The only sound was the distant drip of water somewhere deep inside the church. He called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. "Hello? Is anyone in here?" The only response was silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press against his chest. As he moved deeper into the church, his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The air was thick with a strange energy, and a shiver ran down his back. He reached for his flashlight and clicked it on, its beam cutting through the dark like a knife. And that's when he saw him. Pastor Sam was standing in front of the altar, his back turned to Miller. His hands were clasped in front of him, gripping the worn Bible that never seemed to leave his side. He was muttering to himself, his voice low but intense, like he was praying, or maybe pleading. Miller approached him cautiously. "Pastor Sam," he called, his voice unsure. The old preacher didn't move, didn't respond. Miller stepped closer, a sense of urgency creeping into his actions. "Pastor Sam, you okay? We got a call about you causing a disturbance." The old man's shoulders trembled, but he didn't turn around. He just stood there, his words growing more frantic. "It's too late now," he said, his voice breaking. "It's already begun. They're here, and you can't stop them." Miller frowned, feeling a sense of dread welling up inside him. Who's here?" The old man's head jerked slightly, as if he had heard something behind him. But when he turned to look, there was no one there. "No time." Pastor Sam's voice cracked. You'll see soon enough. It's all coming for us. All of it." Miller's gut twisted. This wasn't like the usual rambling he was used to hearing from the old preacher. Something about the way he was speaking, the raw emotion, the terror, was different. "What's happening, Pastor Sam? You need to tell me what you know. Please." The old man shook his head. "I can't stop it. I tried. I warned them. They laughed. They didn't listen." But now, his voice trailed off as he stared at the altar, his eyes wide with panic. A sudden, deafening sound filled the room. An overwhelming hum that seemed to come from nowhere. Miller's heart raced as the ground beneath his feet trembled slightly. He stumbled back in surprise, his flashlight flickering in his hand. "What the hell?" Miller muttered under his breath. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his bones. And just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence returned, but it was different this time. Heavier, suffocating. Miller could feel his breath coming in short gasps, his senses heightened. Something wasn't right. He had to get out of there, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Pastor Sam's gaze never left the altar, his lips moving rapidly as though he were speaking to someone invisible. "I should have listened to my dreams," the old man whispered, his voice filled with regret. "They tried to warn me, but I thought I could handle it. Now, it's too late." Miller felt a chill creep down his spine, the weight of the man's words settling into his chest. Whatever this was, whatever had Pastor Sam so afraid, it was real. And it wasn't just the ramblings of an old man. Miller didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this any longer. He needed to figure out what was going on, and fast. "Pastor Sam," Miller said, his voice firm now, "I'm taking you out of here. We're going to get you checked out. You're not okay." But before he could take another step, Pastor Sam turned sharply, his eyes wide with terror. "You don't understand," the old man shouted, his voice breaking. "It's already too late. We're all going to pay the price." Miller froze in place, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. What had Pastor Sam just said? "Pay the price," Miller repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The preacher's face crumpled, as though all hope had drained from him. "The prophecy, the curse, it's real. You can't stop it now." Miller's mind raced. Prophecy, curse, what the hell was going on? And that's when the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness once again. The hum started again, but this time it was accompanied by a deep guttural growl, as though something was waiting, lurking just out of sight. The officer's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped his flashlight tighter. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just a dream or a story. It was real. And it was closing in on him. The hum in the church grew louder, and it seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Officer Brian Miller could feel the tremor in his bones as he fumbled for his flashlight. The beam flickered weakly in his hand, casting long shadows that stretched like claws across the broken pews. His breath was shallow, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He had to get out of here. Pastor Sam's voice, now frantic, continued to fill the silence, pulling Miller back toward him. "You don't understand, officer. You don't know what's coming for us." Miller's heart raced as he approached the old preacher, who was still standing rigidly before the altar. The man's eyes were wide, haunted. His hands gripped the Bible tightly, but his knuckles were white, his body trembling. "Pastor Sam," Miller said, his voice laced with authority yet tinged with concern, "you're not making any sense. What are you talking about? What's coming for us?" The old man turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting Miller's. For a moment, the officer saw something that terrified him more than anything else he had experienced in his life. Raw, unfiltered fear. Fear so deep it made the room feel colder. "It's not just a story," Pastor Sam whispered, his voice breaking. "They are real, and they are here." Miller's stomach twisted. "Who is here? What are you talking about?" he demanded. Pastor Sam opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. Instead, his eyes darted nervously to the altar and back to Miller. He seemed as though he was trying to communicate something he couldn't quite say, something too terrifying to voice. Then, without warning, Pastor Sam collapsed to his knees, the Bible slipping from his hands and hitting the cold floor with a thud. Miller knelt beside him, his voice softer now. "Pastor Sam, please, talk to me. What's going on?" The old man didn't respond. He just stared at the altar, his breathing ragged, his eyes unblinking. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, and Miller could feel the temperature drop, a coldness that seeped into his bones. Suddenly, Pastor Sam's voice came again, almost a whisper, but filled with the weight of years of sorrow. "They've been waiting," he muttered, as if trying to put together the shattered pieces of his mind. They've always been here, beneath us, beneath the earth. Miller's mind raced, trying to make sense of the cryptic words. Who was they? What was beneath the earth? And then it hit him, the prophecy, the curse. It all sounded like nonsense, like the ramblings of a deranged old man. But Miller's instincts, his years of experience on the job, told him that something about this wasn't right. There was something deeper at play here, something beyond just a man's delusions. He stood up quickly, scanning the room, his eyes moving from the preacher to the dark corners of the church. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on him, making every breath feel like it took more effort. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Miller's hand hovered near his radio, ready to call for backup. But just as he was about to press the button, a sudden scream echoed through the church, so loud and shrill that it made his blood run cold. It wasn't Pastor Sam's voice. It wasn't human. Miller's heart raced as he spun toward the sound. The scream had come from somewhere deep within the church, echoing through the empty halls, bouncing off the walls like a trapped animal's cry. His instincts kicked in, and before he could even think, he was running toward the sound. As he moved deeper into the church, the darkness seemed to consume him, swallowing the light of his flashlight and leaving him with nothing but the sharp sting of fear in his chest. The floor creaked beneath his boots, and the air smelled of mold and decay. Then he saw it. A figure, a shadow standing in the doorway of the church's small back room. Miller's blood ran cold. The figure was hunched, its back arched unnaturally. Its head was turned downward, so he couldn't make out its face. But the silhouette, pale, gaunt, almost skeletal, sent a wave of dread crashing through him. "Who's there?" Miller demanded, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to remain composed. He raised his flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. The figure didn't move. Miller took another step forward, his eyes locked on the shadow. He was getting closer, but the fear in his chest intensified with every step. The figure stood completely still, as if waiting for him. Then, in one quick motion, the figure jerked its head up. Miller's breath caught in his throat as he saw the face. It was not a human face. It was something else, something alien, something monstrous. The eyes were empty voids, black and hollow. The skin was stretched tight over its bones, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that seemed to spread too wide for its face. Miller froze, his body refusing to obey his mind. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He couldn't move. And then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp that scraped against Miller's ears. "You were warned." The words sent a cold wave through his body. He could barely hear his own heartbeat over the pounding sound in his ears. He tried to step back, but his feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. Before he could react, the figure lunged forward with terrifying speed, disappearing into the shadows. Miller's heart raced, and without thinking, he turned on his heels and sprinted back to Pastor Sam, hoping that the old man's warnings hadn't been in vain. "Pastor Sam," Miller shouted as he burst into the room where the preacher had been. But the old man was gone. There was no sign of him. The Bible lay discarded on the floor, and the air felt colder than ever. Miller's chest tightened. Something was happening, something that was beyond his understanding. Whatever he had walked into tonight, it wasn't just some crazy old man's delusion. This was real, and it was coming for him. Officer Brian Miller's mind raced as he stumbled backward into the cold, empty church. His hand clutched his radio desperately, but the static that greeted him made his stomach churn. The usual comforting crackle of connection was gone, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to deepen the dark void around him. His breath came in shallow gasps as his eyes flickered from corner to corner, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The figure, the thing that had lunged at him, was gone, but the terror it left behind was very much present. Miller's skin crawled as the cold air of the church seemed to close in, pressing against him from all sides. There was no sound, not even the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling. Everything was eerily still. The darkness felt alive, suffocating him. He looked down at the Bible lying on the floor. Pastor Sam's Bible. Miller had barely noticed it earlier, but now it felt as though it was drawing him in. Its pages were yellowed with age, but it wasn't just the book that fascinated him. It was the faint, unnatural glow that seemed to emanate from between the cracked pages. He bent down slowly, his fingers trembling as he reached for it. The glow seemed to pulse in his hands as he lifted the book. He opened it, the pages fragile and brittle beneath his touch. The words were faded, difficult to read, but something about the lines made his chest tighten with dread. He flipped through the pages, and there, near the back of the book, a strange symbol was drawn, etched in what appeared to be some kind of black ink. The lines of the symbol twisted and coiled into a shape that made his heart race. The symbol seemed to throb in his vision, like it was alive. Miller dropped the book with a gasp, backing away, his heart hammering in his chest. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath, trying to shake off the feeling of unease crawling under his skin. He had to leave. He had to get out of here before whatever that thing was came back. But as he turned toward the church doors, they slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside. Panic gripped him like a vice. The walls felt closer, the air heavier. The feeling of being hunted, the sensation of something watching him, was almost unbearable. Miller rushed to the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, desperate now, but it was as though the doors had fused with the frame, unwilling to give even an inch. He spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hands, illuminating the dim church. The pews, the stained glass windows, everything seemed to be watching him. The silence was oppressive, but the thudding in his chest drowned out all other noise. That's when he heard it. A faint whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, came from the far corner of the church. It was a voice, a familiar voice. Miller's heart skipped a beat. "Brian." It was Pastor Sam's voice, but it was distant, weak, fragile. Miller turned sharply, his flashlight sweeping across the room. There, standing in the corner near the altar, was the old preacher, but something was wrong. Pastor Sam was no longer the calm, steady man he had been earlier. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and bloodshot, filled with a terror Miller had never seen before. He was shaking, clutching at his chest as though in pain. Miller's throat tightened. "Pastor Sam," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The preacher's head snapped up, his eyes locking with Miller's. The look in them was not one of recognition. It was fear, a deep, paralyzing fear. "You don't know what you've done," Pastor Sam rasped, his voice hoarse. "It's too late now. They're coming for us." Miller took a hesitant step forward, his eyes scanning the room. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the same oppressive feeling he'd felt before. There was something wrong with this place, something ancient, something beyond comprehension. "What's coming, Pastor? What's happening?" Miller asked, trying to stay calm despite the growing dread in his chest. The preacher's lips trembled, his voice barely audible. "The curse, the one I've tried to keep hidden for so long. They've been waiting for someone like you, someone who could break the seal." Miller's confusion deepened. "What seal? What are you talking about?" The preacher reached out a trembling hand, pointing toward the altar. "It's there. It's all connected. The symbol in the Bible. The door. To them." Miller's stomach churned. His eyes darted toward the altar, where the symbol from the Bible seemed to be etched into the stone floor. It was faint, almost invisible at first glance, but now that he was looking at it, he could see it more clearly. A symbol that seemed to hum with dark energy. Before he could speak, the preacher's body suddenly spasmed, his face contorting in agony. He screamed, a guttural, horrifying sound that echoed through the church. Miller rushed to his side, trying to hold him up, but the preacher was convulsing violently, his skin growing pale and translucent, as if something was draining the life from him. "Pastor Sam," Miller shouted, his voice cracking. "What's happening to you?" The preacher's eyes met his once more, filled with deep sorrow. "It's the price of knowledge, officer, the price of knowing the truth." And then, with one final, horrific cry, Pastor Sam's body went limp in Miller's arms. Miller froze, his heart hammering in his chest. There was no pulse, no sign of life. But something was wrong. The church felt alive. The air was thick with a heavy, unnatural energy that made Miller's skin crawl. The ground beneath his feet began to shake, a low rumble vibrating through the floor. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling as the walls seemed to tremble with an ancient force. Miller looked around in panic, his mind racing. He had to get out of there. He had to get away before whatever had taken the preacher came for him. But as he turned to run, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. Slow, heavy, and deliberate. And they were getting closer. Officer Brian Miller's heart raced in his chest as the footsteps grew louder, closer, and heavier. He froze in place, sweat drenching his brow despite the cold chill that had suddenly settled in the church. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the very air felt suffocating, as though it was alive with something dark and unseen. The steps weren't human. They echoed with an unnatural rhythm, dragging along the floor like something too heavy for the ground to bear. Miller's breath hitched as he turned to face the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But deep down, he knew the weapon wouldn't do anything against whatever had taken hold of this place. He was trapped. The dark church, with its long shadows and eerie silence, had become a labyrinth of terror. The tremors in the ground had stopped, but the air still hummed with a palpable unease. His flashlight flickered, casting brief flashes of light across the room, but it didn't provide any comfort. Just more shadows, deeper than before. Miller's eyes darted back to Pastor Sam's lifeless body lying on the floor. The preacher's form was still, yet the air around him felt charged, as if something beyond this world lingered in his wake. The footsteps came closer, and now Miller could see them. The shadows stretching unnaturally from the far corner of the church. The very darkness seemed to be alive, writhing and slithering along the stone floor, twisting and turning like a living thing. Miller's pulse quickened. A voice, low and rasping, filled with a strange, ancient power, echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have come here." Miller's hand tightened on the flashlight. He couldn't see the source of the voice, but it was everywhere. It was in the walls, the ceiling, and it was inside his head. It felt like the very building itself was speaking to him, taunting him. The shadows in the corner of the church shifted, and a figure stepped forward. A tall, dark shape, its features hidden in the folds of blackness. As it emerged into the dim light, Miller's stomach dropped. The figure was tall, far too tall for any human being. It moved with a fluidity that defied nature, like a shadow given form, its edges constantly shifting and warping. "Who are you?" Miller demanded, his voice shaking with fear. The figure did not answer. Instead, it raised one long skeletal hand, pointing toward the altar. The symbol, etched into the stone floor, seemed to pulse, growing brighter as if responding to the figure's presence. "Look at what you've awakened." The voice rasped again. "You were never meant to uncover this truth." Miller's legs felt like lead as he moved closer to the altar, drawn in by the force he couldn't understand. His mind screamed at him to turn and run, but his body refused to obey. The darkness around him seemed to close in tighter, pressing him toward the center of the church. The air grew colder, and Miller's breath became visible in front of him, swirling in the freezing air. He could feel the energy of the church. It was alive, ancient, and malevolent. There was a presence here that was older than time itself. Miller looked down at the symbol on the floor, his gaze fixated on the intricate, twisting lines that seemed to have a life of their own. It was a curse, a summoning, something far older than anything he could comprehend. And then it hit him, the truth. The realization shattered his thoughts, sending his heart into a frenzy. This is a gateway, isn't it? Miller whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. A door. The figure before him seemed to smile, though its face remained hidden in shadow. The voice was now thick, with a cold, malicious glee. A door, it echoed. A door to a world beyond your understanding. You have unlocked it, Officer Miller. You have opened the way for them. Miller's mind spun, panic and realization crashing together. He wasn't just caught in the midst of a haunting or an old man's delusions. This was something far worse, something ancient. The church had been built over a place, a portal, a dark space meant to stay sealed, hidden from the world. But now he had exposed it, and whatever had been waiting behind that door was about to come through. The figure stepped forward, its form rippling like water, its voice becoming even more insistent, more insidious. The veil is thin now, too thin for you to escape. They will come, and you, like the preacher before you, will be consumed. Miller's blood ran cold. The air in the church was thick with the sound of a distant, low rumble. It was as if the earth itself was groaning, shaking beneath the weight of something immense. Suddenly, there was a flash, a blinding light that filled the room with an unnatural glow. Miller shielded his eyes, but the light seemed to burn right through him. His heart thudded violently in his chest as the ground beneath him shook violently. When the light faded, the figure was gone. And standing in its place was something even worse, something far more terrifying. Shadows swirled around the edges of the room, but in the center, there was an enormous, writhing mass of darkness, a swirling vortex that seemed to tear apart the fabric of reality itself. The portal. Miller could hear the faint whispers now, soft at first, like distant voices on the wind. But as the portal grew stronger, the whispers became louder, clearer. The voices, low and guttural, sounded like they were calling out to him, beckoning him toward the center of the vortex. Something reached out of the portal, thin tendrils of blackness that lashed out like serpents, curling toward him. Miller stumbled backward, his heart pounding with pure terror. He was trapped. This was it. There was no way out. And then, just as the tendrils closed in, a voice called out, breaking through the oppressive darkness. "Get out of there, Miller." It was a woman's voice, filled with urgency and fear. Miller turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. Another officer, his partner, Detective Sarah Hayes. She rushed forward, pulling him away from the dark mass, grabbing his arm with a strength that seemed to defy the chaos around them. "Come on. We need to leave, now." But it was too late. The portal roared to life, its hunger insatiable. The walls of the church trembled and cracked as the tendrils reached for them, pulling at the very essence of the world. The light from the portal grew, blinding them as the very air seemed to tear apart. Miller's mind raced, and then everything went dark. The darkness swallowed them whole. The air, thick and suffocating, seemed to close in, crushing their chests as they stumbled backward from the swirling black vortex in the center of the church. The tendrils of darkness, long, thin, and serpentine, reached out, striking at the very fabric of their reality. With each lashing movement, they seemed to tear at the world, unraveling everything in their path. "Move, move," Sarah Hayes yelled, pulling Miller by the arm as she led him toward the church's exit. Her voice was urgent, frantic, every word laced with fear, but her grip was strong, determined. She wasn't going to let him fall. She wasn't going to let them both be consumed by whatever was coming through that door. Miller's heart pounded in his chest, his mind spinning. His body felt like it was moving in slow motion, like every step he took was more difficult than the last. The tremors beneath their feet intensified, shaking the very foundation of the church. The walls groaned, cracks spreading through the stone like veins in a body, threatening to tear apart at any moment. A loud guttural growl echoed from the depths of the portal, as if the very earth was speaking, warning them. The air around them grew colder, and Miller could feel the presence of something monstrous, something ancient, moving closer, circling them like a predator stalking its prey. "We're not going to make it," Miller gasped, his voice shaky. "We need to do something. There's no way out." But Sarah didn't slow down. She kept running, dragging Miller along as the darkness surged behind them. The tendrils lashed at the walls, leaving deep gouges in the stone. The church seemed to be alive, its very bones screaming in agony as the portal grew stronger, more violent. "Keep running," Sarah shouted, not daring to look back. She could hear the horrible sound of the shadows pursuing them, feel the pressure building with each passing second. She wasn't about to let Miller, or herself, fall into whatever nightmare was unfolding behind them. But even as they ran, it felt like the church was closing in. The exit, once so close, seemed miles away. The door was at the far end of the church, but it felt like they were running in circles, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Miller's mind raced as they reached the door. The wooden panels cracked and splintered from the force of the dark energy that surrounded them. But it wouldn't open. The door refused to budge. "No," Miller yelled, slamming his shoulder into it, desperate to escape. But the door didn't move. It was as though the church itself had sealed them inside, as though they had been caught in a trap. Suddenly, the portal let out a deafening roar, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The air grew thick with a tangible weight, and the shadows behind them grew, expanding, reaching, closing in with a vengeance. Miller's pulse raced. This was it. They were going to die here, trapped in this cursed place. But then, in the corner of his eye, Miller saw something he hadn't noticed before. A faint light, flickering like a distant star, shone from behind the altar. It was a soft, almost imperceptible glow, but it was enough to catch his attention. Without thinking, Miller reached for Sarah, pulling her toward the light. "This way," he said, his voice hoarse with desperation. "There's something. I don't know what, but we have to try." Sarah didn't hesitate. She followed Miller as they sprinted past the pulpit, dodging the now violent tendrils that slithered toward them from the dark mass. The church itself seemed to shift as they neared the altar, the walls groaning in protest. The pulsing glow grew brighter, stronger, guiding them through the darkness. As they reached the altar, Miller felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The light was coming from an ornate stone slab on the ground, just beneath the altar. The slab was covered in intricate markings, symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them, like they were alive. "Miller, look out!" Sarah's warning came too late. One of the dark tendrils lashed out, striking Miller in the shoulder. He gasped in pain, falling to the floor as the darkness tried to pull him into its cold, suffocating grip. The tendril wrapped around his body, squeezing tight, as if it were trying to crush him into oblivion. Sarah acted quickly, drawing her weapon and firing into the darkness. But the bullets did nothing, disappearing into the swirling black mass as if they had been swallowed whole. Desperation surged through her veins, and she knew they were running out of time. "Help me," Miller gasped, struggling against the tendril that held him fast. His strength was fading, the darkness seeping into his limbs, threatening to pull him deeper into the abyss. But then, just as Sarah was about to charge forward and try again, the stone slab beneath the altar cracked open with a sudden violent jolt. A blast of white-hot energy erupted from the opening, throwing Sarah backward with a force that sent her crashing into the stone wall. She screamed as she hit the ground, pain shooting through her body. Miller, still trapped in the tendril's grip, watched in stunned silence as the light from the stone slab grew brighter, blinding him with its intensity. The darkness recoiled, pulling back from the light as if it were repelled by it. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the walls of the church began to collapse, the very structure of the building groaning as if it were alive, fighting against the light that was pouring from the altar. And then, in a final, desperate move, the darkness let out one last, terrifying roar. The ground beneath them cracked open, and the portal, its tendrils now retreating, began to implode upon itself. The light from the altar was too strong, too powerful. The dark energy that had held the church in its grip began to dissipate, fading into nothingness. The last thing Miller saw before the light consumed everything was Sarah, her face etched with a mix of shock and disbelief, her eyes locked onto his. And then, silence. The light was blinding, its purity overwhelming. Miller shielded his eyes as the last remnants of the darkness began to crumble away. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on him, the fear, the choking terror, began to lift. The air, once thick with the stench of shadow, now smelled fresh and clean. It was as though the very atmosphere was breathing again, drawing in the breath of life. Miller didn't know what had just happened. The church, which had felt like a prison, was now eerily calm. The loud rumblings and crashes of the crumbling building had stopped. All that remained was silence. Peaceful, still silence. "Sarah," Miller called out, his voice shaking. "Sarah, are you okay?" There was no response at first. Panic gripped Miller's heart. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain in his side where the tendril had struck him. His legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to move forward. He had to find her. "Sarah," he shouted again, his breath ragged with urgency. His heart was pounding in his chest, and a deep sense of dread gnawed at him. He couldn't lose her. Not now, not after everything they had been through. The altar, now bathed in the soft, radiant light, stood tall, almost untouched by the devastation around it. The stone slab beneath it was cracked open, but something was different. The energy that had erupted from it seemed to have a gentle pull, like a beacon guiding them. Miller stumbled forward, each step more painful than the last, but he couldn't stop. He reached the altar, his eyes scanning the debris scattered around it, searching for Sarah. And then, just as his hope began to wane, he saw her. She was lying against the stone wall, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was shallow. Panic surged through Miller's veins, and he rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. "Sarah, no, no, please," he cried out, shaking her gently. "Wake up. We made it. You're safe, just wake up." Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, Miller thought she was going to respond, but her lips barely parted, and her voice was little more than a whisper. "Miller," she murmured, her eyes flickering open but distant, as if she were seeing something beyond the room. The light, it was the key. Miller didn't understand. His heart ached seeing her like this, so fragile, so vulnerable. "What do you mean? Sarah, what happened?" But Sarah's gaze grew distant, her breath labored. It's not over," she whispered, her voice growing weaker. "You have to finish what we started." Miller's eyes widened. He knew what she meant. The portal was gone, the darkness seemed to have retreated, but the power of whatever was pulling them into this nightmare was still lingering. It wasn't over. Not yet. "Sarah, stay with me. We can get out of here. We can make it," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't give up on me now." But Sarah's lips curled into a faint smile, one that was filled with understanding. "I'm not giving up," she whispered. "But you have to be the one to end it. You have to finish it for both of us." Miller's heart skipped a beat. Her words were like a weight around his chest, sinking him deeper into fear. He didn't want to lose her. He couldn't. "Sarah, please don't leave me." She took a slow, shaky breath, reaching out to touch his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. She held his hand tightly, and for a brief moment, he felt the strength she had always carried within her. Until now. Her eyes locked onto his, her voice a mere breath, as she spoke the final words that would change everything. "Trust the light," she whispered. Miller's heart shattered in that instant. The pain was unbearable. Sarah had always been strong, always the one to push forward, to lead. Now she was fading, leaving him alone to face whatever this darkness was. But he couldn't let her words go unheard. He couldn't let it end like this. The light. It had to be the key. Miller stood, tears stinging his eyes, and took a deep, steadying breath. He turned toward the glowing altar, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of Sarah's sacrifice settling over him. The altar was no longer just a beacon of light. It was the key to their salvation. And Miller knew he had to unlock its full power, even if it meant facing whatever darkness still lingered. With every ounce of his strength, he moved to the center of the altar, his hand reaching toward the stone slab. The cracks in the stone seemed to pulse with energy, and as his fingers made contact, the slab began to hum, resonating with the power that had been hidden within the church for so long. The ground beneath him began to tremble once more, but this time, it wasn't the darkness that shook the church, it was the power of the light, the force that had been dormant until now. It was the very force that had the power to undo everything the darkness had tried to do. Miller closed his eyes, focusing on Sarah's last words. The light. He had to trust it. He had to let it guide him. He pressed down on the stone slab, and the energy around him intensified. The air crackled with power, and the church seemed to groan, as if it were waking from a deep slumber. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a final, deafening surge, the light exploded outward, filling the entire church. The walls, the floor, the very air shimmered with energy, and Miller was enveloped in a brilliant white light. He felt the darkness, no, the evil, begin to unravel, retreating into the void from where it had come. The church, once a place of despair, now glowed with purity. The darkness was gone. The evil was gone. And all that remained was light. Miller's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, the weight of everything he had just witnessed crashing down on him. He had done it. He had ended it. But as the light began to fade and the church returned to its natural state, there was one thing that remained: Sarah's absence. Her sacrifice had allowed them to succeed. She had been the key all along. Tears streamed down Miller's face as he stood in the center of the altar, the last remnants of the darkness dissipating into nothing. He had lost Sarah, but she had saved them all. Her memory would live on. And in the end, Miller knew one thing for certain: no darkness could ever extinguish the light of sacrifice. Miller stood at the center of the altar, trembling, his heart racing with a mix of grief and determination. The light around him grew more intense, filling the church with an almost unbearable brightness. The air was thick, vibrating with the raw power that was finally being unleashed. And yet, through the chaos, one thought pierced through his mind. Sarah had given everything for this moment. His hand still rested against the stone slab of the altar, his fingers pressing down as he could feel the pulse of energy beneath it. It was like nothing he had ever experienced. It wasn't just power. It was life itself, flowing through the very veins of the earth. The church, once a place of fear and darkness, was now on the brink of salvation. The evil they had fought against, the dark force that had nearly consumed them, was retreating, unraveling with every beat of the light's pulse. But amidst the swirling energy, a heavy emptiness tugged at Miller's chest. Sarah was gone. Her final words echoed in his mind. Trust the light. He didn't understand what she had meant at the time. But now, standing in the center of that radiant power, he could feel the truth of it deep within his soul. Suddenly, the brightness surrounding him began to dim, and the intense hum of the altar's power faded into a soft, steady pulse. The tremors in the ground ceased, and for the first time since they had arrived, there was complete silence. Miller opened his eyes, blinking against the afterglow, and looked around. The church had changed. The walls, once cracked and decayed, were now whole again, glowing with a soft, golden light. The debris on the floor had disappeared, and the stone pews were back in their rightful places, standing strong and undisturbed. The once barren altar, bathed in light, looked ancient but renewed, a symbol of hope in the midst of devastation. But the greatest change was the absence of the oppressive darkness. The shadow that had loomed over them, creeping through the air like a suffocating fog, was gone. There was no trace left of it. The air felt clear, free of the heaviness that had clung to them throughout their entire journey. It was as though the evil that had threatened to consume them all had been erased, vanished without a trace. But even as the church seemed to be reborn, Miller's heart ached with the knowledge that Sarah was no longer with him. He stood there, the weight of her sacrifice settling over him like an unspoken promise. She had known what was at stake. She had understood that the darkness would never truly go away without a price. And now, in her final moments, she had given everything to ensure they would win. His gaze turned slowly toward the altar, his eyes lingering on the spot where Sarah had fallen. He could still feel her presence, as if she were still there with him, guiding him, comforting him even in her absence. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking as the tears he had been holding back finally fell. "You did it. You saved us." The light around him flickered for a moment, as if acknowledging his words. And then something unexpected happened. From the center of the altar, a soft, ethereal glow began to form. At first it was nothing more than a shimmering wisp, but as Miller watched, it began to take shape, a silhouette. Slowly, the form became clearer, and he gasped as he recognized the familiar shape of Sarah standing before him, bathed in the softest glow. She was there, not in a way she had been before, but as something different, something more. Her face was radiant, free of the pain and exhaustion that had plagued her in the final moments of her life. She looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth, and though she did not speak, Miller could hear her voice in his mind. "I'm here, Miller," the words echoed softly. "I'm here, and I'll always be with you. You finished it. You were strong enough to carry on." Miller reached out, his hand trembling, but when his fingers touched the light, it was as if it wasn't truly there, like he was touching a memory, a fleeting impression of something once real. Yet the peace he felt, the calm that washed over him, was undeniable. For a moment, everything made sense. Sarah had known this would happen. She had known she wouldn't survive, but she had believed in him, believed that he could carry the torch and finish what they had started. And now, standing there in the light, she was telling him it was over. The darkness was gone. The world was safe. And Sarah, her soul, was at peace. "I miss you, Sarah," Miller whispered, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "But I'll carry on. I'll make sure your sacrifice wasn't in vain." The light around him grew brighter for a brief moment, as if Sarah herself was smiling, before it faded completely, leaving Miller standing alone at the altar. The church was still glowing, but the ethereal presence of Sarah was gone. And though he felt a deep sense of loss, there was also a profound sense of peace within him. The church was no longer a place of darkness, no longer a symbol of fear. It was a place of hope, of redemption, of love. Miller had faced the greatest challenge of his life, and he had emerged victorious. And though the cost had been unimaginable, the result was worth it. With one last glance at the altar, Miller turned and walked toward the door. The world outside was waiting, and though the path ahead would be difficult, he was no longer afraid. He knew that Sarah's spirit would always be with him, guiding him, just as it had before. The sun was rising, casting its golden light across the world, and for the first time in a long time, Miller felt the warmth of a new beginning. The light had won, and with it, the promise of a brighter future.